So, I'd like to take this time to introduce Andrew Gurstelle. Um, so, Dr. Gurstelle is an anthropologist interested in the history and archaeology of West Africa. This interest intersects with museums and heritage in the Atlantic African diaspora and how African peoples and objects are represented in the museums throughout the world. In particular, his research explores how partnerships between international and community museums might be the key to safeguarding African cultural landscapes. Since 2001, Dr. Gerstel has been the director of the Save Hills Archaeological Research Project, an archaeology and oral history project investigating the Shabi Yoruba Kingdom in the Republic of Benin. Over the course of the project, interest in the research findings grew into a collaborative effort between archaeologists, local historians, and school teachers. Dr. Gurstelle is committed to Wake Forest University's teacher scholar ideal. His vision for the future includes promoting the museum's potential as a resource and for anthropological research. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Gurstelle.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today as the first speaker in today's hackathon series. I wanted to use my time today to go over some things that are already pretty well known, pretty well understood about the possibilities for new technologies within the museum space, something that probably everyone here has already considered. But I also want to take some of my time to go over in a little bit more detail one case study, one example about how new technologies, distributed ledgers or blockchain technologies could revolutionize in some very interesting ways how museums go about doing their business. And I want to take the time to tell a very long story, the biography of one object in particular, held now at the Museum of Anthropology at Wake Forest University. But before I get to that, I just want to review a couple of truisms. One is this question of authenticity and provenance in museums, and it gets to the heart of why some kind of secure information technology like a distributed ledger has a place in the very non-digital space of the museum. So why does information matter in museums at all? Information is actually pretty important to why people even go to museums, the whole idea of trust placed into museums. And this has to do with the idea that museums have value because they have an aura of authenticity, that the things on display in museums are real, that they're purported to be what they say they are. Now, there are frauds, there are forgeries, there are bad actors within all spaces, including museums. And so combating fraud is critical to maintaining museum authenticity. And museums do this through a concept called provenance. That is, they have documentation, historical records, or other forms of evidence that chart where an object has been, who owned it, and how it's kind of gone down this ladder of provenance and history to wind up in a museum's collection. Take, for example, this painting, which at one time was purported to be a 17th century Dutch masterwork, a very incredibly important painting. However, it turned out that this was actually a forgery. It was produced in the 1940s at the same time period that it was trying to be sold, and that it wasn't at all what it claimed to be. Museums taking this and putting it on display risk damaging their credibility, their authenticity, their long-term solvency by buying into forgeries like this. So understanding an object's exchange history becomes critical for any good museum work. Now, in the past, museums have largely viewed these exchange histories as kind of linear relationships, a lot of zero-sum exchanges where the object is in its totality, in its completeness, being transferred between different parties. This could happen through gifts, private sales, auctions, these kind of pretty typical mechanisms of transferring ownership. Of course, before they even entered this world of galleries and art dealers, many museum objects started off as connected to systems of barter or simply payment. And of course, some objects have darker histories where they were stolen. In either case, all of these different forms of exchange are kind of one-way streets and zero sum. They're all going in or nothing is going in. So this history of kind of how an object gets to a museum, it had a very linear conceptualization for most of the time museums have been around. So of course, distributed ledger and blockchain technologies can change all of this. Looking forward, how could fractional ownership change the history or change the future, I'm sorry, of museum ownership? Lots of different ways. And I'm sure many of you have already thought about the different ways that interest or ownership in an object could be fractionalized and securely tabulated using these kind of distributed ledgers. It also allows for kind of new forms of investment in museum objects where you could, in a sense, crowdfund shares in a single object, or conversely, ascertain ownership rights in an entire amorphous collection of objects and not just an individual thing. This also has unique implications for museum collections specifically, which oftentimes drop out of this network of gifts, private sales, and auctions. But museum collections are particularly sensitive to other forms of transfer, namely repatriation, the returning of museum objects to source communities, as well as mergers. Museums are expensive enterprises, and they occasionally do cease operations. And when that happens, their collections need to get folded in, ideally to another museum's holdings. So let's focus in on this one object like I promised. In order to illustrate kind of the complexities of these histories of this provenance chain and how it might complicate efforts to assign fractional ownership, I want us to zoom in on this single object, one of these scenarios for our blockchain hackathon. This object, which we lovingly call number 1978.E.87, could also be called an oil dish. We're pretty sure it was created in Fiji in the Pacific Islands sometime in the late 18th century, probably right around 1770 or so. And in the Fijian language, it's called Sedra ne Waiwai, meaning that it's a dish for scented coconut oil. In other case studies involving repatriation and the potential use for distributed ledger, we've seen these cases identify at least three basic stakeholders in thinking about who has ownership potential or interest in these kind of objects. At the minimum, these stakeholders typically include the displaying institution, the institution that holds it right now. So the Museum of Anthropology, I suppose, for this particular object, as well as the source country. In this case, Fiji. The Fijian national government might be a stakeholder for this object. And then finally, a community or organization who might claim cultural ownership. This category is a little bit harder to tease apart. In order to understand who, what community, what organization, what amorphous group might have a cultural stake, we're going to have to understand who's owned this object, how this object has been used in its 250-year history. I'm reminded of a very interesting quote, which I'll use to kind of cap this portion of my talk, and to think that in an unusually large proportion of possible scenarios involving museum objects like this, it's possible for all stakeholders to be in a better situation than they are currently. Following from the principles laid out in this paper, and I encourage you to read this paper, the number of potential negotiated arrangements is near infinite. So let's look at some of these potential negotiated arrangements to see how many different stakes, how many different ways of assigning ownership are possible, even in a simple object like this wooden container. So let's begin at the beginning. As I mentioned before, this dish likely comes from Fiji. And so even though we don't know the name of the artist who carved this wooden bowl, we can postulate that a Fijian artist did at some point carve it. Fijian carving is well known. This engraving that I'm using for the background image is from 1840, and it depicts a wide range of Fijian ritual carving bowls. Some of them very, very similar in form to the Sedra ne Waiwai from the university's collection, dating some 50, 60 years before this engraving was made. Even though we don't know the name of the artist, we can assume that at some point, a Fijian artist created it, establishing this original stake in Fiji. However, it's unlikely that the artist was the person who used this object, who gave it any kind of cultural significance. Instead, this kind of ritual bowl would have been used by a Fijian bete. a kind of priest class within the Fijian society. This building shows a priestly dwelling, likely where a bowl like this would have been used. How long it was used in Fiji, we don't really know. Again, the artist is not known, and the priest who used it is also not known. In fact, this bowl was never attested to coming from Fiji. The only reason the museum thinks it is Fijian is based on its form and the wood that it was created out of, as well as notes from where it was actually originally collected and brought into museum collections initially. On the island of Tonga. Tonga is another Pacific island, but some ways north and removed of Fiji. However, the Fijian bowl was collected there. How it got to Tonga is also up for speculation, but there was quite a bit of trade between the two communities and the two islands. And it's very likely that this scented oil dish would have been used by Tongan elites, potentially as part of an exchange route. There's other kinds of material culture that are well known from the 1770s and 1780s as circulating among these societies in kind of an ongoing trade network or relationship. From Tonga, though, that's when it enters European collections for the first time, and it enters the documentary record for the first time. The first known source for this bowl comes from the ship ledger of Captain James Cook. Captain James Cook was an English explorer and well known for documenting many islands in the Pacific Ocean, charting them for European maps, and sailing to many islands, including Tonga and Fiji, before other Europeans. During Captain Cook's second voyage, he left in 1774 and arrived in Tonga in 1775, where he spent a majority of his time. He returned to England in 1776, and when he did, he brought with him a host of different objects, both natural and cultural, to populate the museums of Europe that were burgeoning at the time period. In addition to exploring, Cook brought back what we might call souvenirs or memento or scientific specimen in order to give to scientists and museum operators as kind of a larger educational mandate of this time period. So already we have a link from Fiji, from the person who created it, its use within Fijian society, its exchange to a Tongan society, and then an exchange again from Tongan to British society. Following Captain Cook, this object was given to a close friend of his, Sir Ashton Lever. Lever operated a museum called the Leverian Museum in fashionable Leicester Square in London. This was one of the largest natural history museums at the time. His Hala Fusakan was considered the epitome, even better than the British Museum. However, it was a for-profit museum, a private enterprise not funded by the state, and over time, the museum was losing money. So while Ashton Lever picked up this bowl, probably in 1776, by 1786, he had to sell the museum. He actually sold it as a lottery, publishing lottery tickets, and then calling a number until someone won. The person who won the lottery and therefore won this entire museum, there's almost a movie in here, was a man named James Parkinson. Parkinson was not a museum operator, he was a lawyer, but he did have some business sense. He decided to reduce the operating expenses of the Leverian Museum and moved its entire collection, including the Fijian bowl, to another building in the Blackfriars Bridge neighborhood of London, where rent was a little bit cheaper. Despite his best efforts, 20 years later, the museum went out of business for good. The entire collections were auctioned off, and some of the material, including the Fijian bowl, was purchased at auction by a man named Richard Hall Clark. Clark took the bowl back to Devonshire in remote rural England, and he there built a chapel on his property, which he transformed into the Chapel Museum, a museum dedicated to the life and adventures of Captain James Cook. So now the bowl is put back on display in a new museum. This time, though, not as a natural history specimen, not as an example of a far off culture, but this time the example, a museum object exemplifying a British hero, kind of not used incidentally for its relationship to the Pacific, but more so to cast a spotlight on British excellence. In Devonshire, it will remain for 150 years until, just like in the plot of Downton Abbey, these grand estates go out of business and they are forced to auction off their collections. The art collection at the Chapel Museum is bought by the well-known London dealer Ernest Oley. Oley operates Berkeley Galleries, a well-known tribal art gallery in the mid 20th century in London. But Oley decides that this piece, this bowl, doesn't have enough value to be sold at his gallery. He's more interested in larger, high-value pieces, not small wood carvings, which don't fetch a lot of money. So instead, he takes this bowl and he gives it to another enterprise of his, the Abbey Art Center, an arts collective in London. And in an old barn, they have a small ethnographic museum to inspire the artists who come there to draw in this kind of post-World War II, post-impressionistic time period. At the Abbey Art Center, another dealer notices it, a London dealer named Ralph Nash, and he strikes a deal with Oley to purchase the bowl. At this point, 10 years later or so, a lot of the tribal art collections have been sold and dealers are looking for more and more material. What Oley wouldn't have sold 10 years earlier, Nash will sell now. Nash actually sells it to another dealer named Alexander Martin, who publishes it in a small exhibit called Art of the South Seas. While it's on exhibit, it's noticed by one of the world's most preeminent collectors of tribal and ancient art, a man named George Ortiz. George Ortiz lives in Vienna, but he travels all throughout Europe collecting art. He is the grandson of a Bolivian tin baron, one of the wealthiest men of the 20th century. And so George Ortiz has grown up his entire life in incredible wealth. As part of his upbringing, he developed a taste for collecting, first collecting Greco-Roman antiquities, and then moving on to tribal art generally. After seeing this bowl, this Fijian bowl, brought out of the Pacific from Captain Cook, stored in Devonshire for 150 years, inspiring formal artists for 10 years, now in the hands of Ortiz. Ortiz adds it to his collection of materials from around the world, widely regarded as a collection of some of the finest examples anywhere of different kinds of Pacific Ocean art, different kinds of African art, different kinds of ancient Greek art. However, in 1977, George Ortiz's daughter, Grisella, is kidnapped off the streets of Switzerland. The kidnappers hold her for several $1 million ransom, and George Ortiz, while pleading to the press, reveals that all of his family's fortunes are gone. They have their holdings, but they have no cash flow. He's forced to borrow money from family and friends to pay the kidnappers, and fortunately, Grisella is released unharmed. However, Ortiz now has several millions in debt that he needs to recoup. And so to do so, he decides to sell part of his art collection. So in 1977, a large portion of his Pacific collection goes under the auction block at Sotheby's, or on the auction block at Sotheby's. There, it's purchased by this man, Gordon Haynes, the son of the well-known textile family of Winston-Salem. That Haynes family, Gordon Haynes, is a very influential and philanthropic figure in the Winston-Salem and North Carolina art scene. In fact, the old Haynes mansion is now SECA, the Southeastern Contemporary Center for the Arts, attesting to the family's legacy in patronizing arts. And of course, Haynes is no different in this case. Haynes's mission in buying the collection from Ortiz is actually not for himself, not to hold these objects at all, but rather to immediately pass these on to Wake Forest University and to the Museum of Anthropology. In 1975, the Museum of Anthropology decides to begin collecting its own materials, to have its own permanent collection to use for students at the university. Gordon Haynes hears of this, and being friends with then director at the time, Dr. Pendleton Banks, he arranges for all of these seed collections, these examples of ethnographic material from around the world, to be sent to the museum to form these initial holdings. So along the way, this simple Fijian bowl is used in a dozen different contexts by a dozen different people, each ascribing it their own meaning, their own use, the only reason why they decided to keep this object and preserve it for 250 years. So who are the stakeholders here? The displaying institution, Wake Forest University, easy enough. The source country, Fiji, again, easy enough. We just have to look at the beginning and the end of this provenance chain. But what about the communities or organizations who claim cultural heritage or cultural ownership of this object. Certainly, the Fijian priests that used this object inscribed with it its initial reason for being, likely the reason that it was carved in the first place. But it wasn't the only reason that this object was preserved over the centuries. Indeed, the biggest explanation that it survived for so long was that it was reflective of Captain Cook and not reflective of Fijian culture at all. So does Captain Cook's descendants or the Captain Cook fan club, do they have an interest in this kind of object? Or what about the artist at the Abbey Art Center who studied properties of form and shape and color by looking at objects like this and other ethnographic material? Or what about George Ortiz, who was forced to sell this object because of a personal tragedy that befell him? And clearly he sold this object under duress. Do any of these groups have a claim to this object? In previous years, the zero-sum nature of exchange relationships would state no. But now, with the possibility of fractional ownership easier to ascertain and securely hold, is it possible to think about assigning this in retrospect, not just moving forward, with fractional ownership becoming more and more a norm, more and more a feature of constellations of ownership going forward? But can we think about how this might be assigned in the past? And could any distributed ledger technology that's trying to incorporate these kinds of considerations, could it be open and flexible enough to accommodate movement in both directions? And how might a system go about of even assigning the relative value of each of these stakes? You know, this gets me back to that quote I shared earlier because I sneakily left off an important second part. After my emphasis, it's important to note that because the best outcomes will vary from situation to situation, it's important to pay nuanced attention to the specifics of each circumstance, to listen to the needs of the stakeholders, and to design the process by which the parties come together. This focus on process is critical because the potential solutions are not merely financial and transactional, but cultural and human. It's important to note that this is a human process, that organizing all of these stakeholders, listening to them, debating them about the relative stakes or interests in this, and then assigning that, that's not something that can be purely done mechanically. Rather, it has to be done humanistically, listening to people, making evaluations, making opinions. But of course, the technology has also got to be there. Thank you, everyone, for having me this wonderful morning, and thank you for listening. I don't know if it's possible to take any questions on this platform, but I'd be happy to since we have a minute or two left.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions for Dr. Gurstelle, you can go to, if you're on the Discord, you can go to the channel called Session 1 underneath the speakers category. And you can ask a question there. We'll be monitoring that channel. But we don't have any questions right now, so we'll just wait a little bit.
Great. Well, thank you, Lawton, for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for coming. You know, we're really happy to have you speak at our event. You know, like I was running around talking to some people, like the staff and all that, but I'll be able to, I think we were recording this as well. And I think it's going to be uploaded to YouTube as well. So I can't wait to go back and watch this talk. From what I heard in the background, it sounded really, really interesting. I hope this wasn't too confusing for you either, because I don't know if everybody's familiar with Twitch and Discord and all that. It's kind of like circuitous in a way. But we hope the experience for you has been good as well.
Yeah, it's been great. Easy enough. I'm no Discord. I don't use Twitch much, but I get that it can all be kind of a simulcast or live stream to every other platform. I'm happy to speak, and it was my goal with this was really just to provide a little bit of appreciation for how rich some of these backstories are, and like all the different twists and turns and ways that these objects are preserved. One thing that I like to question everyone is to consider that for all the museum objects, obviously the majority of everything that humans have ever created was all at one point tossed into like a big incinerator, right? I mean, we don't have most things that were ever made. So the question is always, why did we feel that this object should be preserved? Like, why did this bowl get preserved for 250 years? And for 150 years of it, it was because Captain Cook once touched it. I mean, that was kind of the reason, is that it became this shrine object to a British explorer. And so just trying to appreciate like all the different reasons people held on to an object, because for all rights, you know, statistically, everything should get thrown away. And it's very, very curious when anything doesn't get thrown away.